All right, so welcome back from your break. We talked about contracts this morning and helping people enter into a sales contract. And now we're going to roll into talking about the real property valuation. You should be on page 388 in your textbook. And if you have your slides, you're on page 121 on your PowerPoint slides. Real property valuation. The valuing of real property. Why would it be important? Does anybody want to tell me why you think it would be important for real estate agents to understand the valuation process of real property? Lee.
So you can give a listing price.
Lee said so that you can give a listing price, help a seller. What did we call it when we talked about agency? Come up with a
market.
You're going to do a comparative market analysis, absolutely, to help the seller come up with a probable selling price. Because a lot of sellers have no idea. And if we don't understand the process that appraisers use to value a property, then we won't do a very good job helping our sellers come up with a probable selling price. Who else might you want to do a market analysis for? Karina said the bank or the lender. That's who the appraiser is going to do an appraisal for. But who else as a broker should you be doing? Oh, wait, you know what? You're absolutely right, Karina, because what's it called when we do something like that for the bank as an agent?
BPO.
Michael said a BPO. Absolutely, a broker price opinion. So you're absolutely correct. So we do BPOs for a lender as well if they contact us about a property that's gone into foreclosure. But you know, guys, even as a buyer's agent, if you're an exclusive buyer representative and the buyer says to you, how much should I offer on this property? You would need to do a market analysis for your buyer as well to help them in making a decision of how much to offer. Because we talked about the process. When a buyer goes under contract, remember we talked about some of the things that a buyer has to do once they are under contract, when they're in their due diligence period. What did we say some of the things that a buyer has to do, Sarah?
Check out the price of the homeowner's insurance.
Check out the price of homeowner's insurance. What else does a buyer do? Cindy? A home inspection. Guys, do you think a home inspection costs the buyer money up front? Typically does, correct? So if your buyer offers an amount that is way over what the property is worth, and then they go and pay for these things, home inspections, even the appraisal, and we don't get the value, and the seller doesn't lower the price or refuses to lower the price because he doesn't have to. We're going to talk about that. Your buyer would have all that money they have spent when if we had educated the buyer in the beginning about what would be a good offering price by doing a market analysis for them, they might not have offered so much and they might not have been out those expenses. So, you know, doing that market analysis is a client-based function. We talked about that. We're going to talk about it again in this chapter. You do that for your client, whether your client is a buyer or a seller. You help them understand what is a good, you know, listing price for a seller, offering price for a buyer. They still have the ultimate decision to make, but we need to aid them with that. And if we don't understand how an appraiser values property, we're not going to understand how to help the buyer and seller in that process either. So the first thing I put together this morning is, for you guys, is a little quiz, but it's going to be on the board, about facts and myths surrounding appraisals. And I'm going to put these up there and see what you guys think. But if you have any others after I've done this, please, you know, offer them up so that we can determine whether something you've heard or been told or just thought is true or not about the appraisal process. So the first question says, the money put into a home translates dollar to dollar for value on an appraisal. Do you think this is a fact or a myth?
Myth.
It is a myth, guys. It is. We're going to be talking about in the beginning of this chapter today the difference between cost and value, and they're not the same. but I guarantee you some sellers will think they are. So it's really good for you to have this knowledge when you go on a listing appointment and you're doing a market analysis for your seller, because they may want to say, well, I paid this much money for this. How come you're only giving me this much value on that market analysis? Or how come the appraiser only gave this much value? So that's important to know. Appraisers set the price of a property. Myth or fact? Myth. An appraiser, you're going to find out that the appraisal is defined as an estimate or an opinion of value. It's just their opinion. Is it a valuable opinion to people in the real estate transaction? Absolutely. But it's still just an opinion. If you have an appraisal, you don't need a home inspection because they perform the same duties. Myth. Sarah was very adamant about that one. Myth. Absolutely, it's a myth. The appraiser's job is not the same as the home inspector. The home inspector is going to be looking at things like the condition of the property for the buyer. The appraiser is there to make sure the buyer doesn't pay too much for the property. Fact or myth?
I say fact with VA.
Lee says, I say fact with a VA loan. It's technically a myth because actually the appraiser, you're going to find out, is there to protect the lender, not the buyer. Even in a VA transaction or an FHA transaction where they're government backed, that's why it's even more important in an FHA or VA loan, because what did we talk about when we talked about mortgage loans when it's an FHA or a VA loan? What did we say that the agencies did for the lender? What does FHA or VA do for the lender?
Back it up.
Lee says they back it up. The same way private mortgage insurance backs up a loan for a conventional loan if you don't pay enough down. The VA and FHA guarantee the lender a certain percentage of their money if a borrower defaults. So the appraiser is there to make sure that the lender doesn't put more money into the property than it's worth. Remember when we learned how to figure out the loan to value ratio, T-bar? And we said it's the purchase price or the appraised value. Whichever is less is how you calculate the buyer's loan amount, multiply that by the loan to value ratio. Because the lender says, oh, you're under contract, Sarah, with the seller to buy this house for $150,000, but the appraisal only came in at $145,000. We'll loan money based on the $145,000. Is she allowed to pay the $5,000 difference if she wants to? Absolutely. And is a seller allowed to lower the price by $5,000 if they're willing to?
Yes.
Sure. But the appraiser is there to make sure the lender doesn't invest more into the property than it's worth. But we feel like it's there for the buyer, especially in our market with VA loans. The last one, an appraisal is not required in every real estate transaction. Myth or fact? Fact. What would be an example of a transaction that would not require an appraisal? Cash. Michael says cash. Guys, if the buyer is paying cash, there's no requirement for an appraisal. And even if the buyer's putting a large enough down payment, I think I told y'all yesterday about my investor who was buying investment properties. Remember I told you about the possibility of loan fraud there. The investor who put so much money down that the lender did not require an appraisal because they had so much equity and they knew that the lender didn't even require the buyer to have an appraisal. And guys, a lot of people feel like that the appraisal is for the buyer because remember on our closing disclosure, who was responsible for paying for the appraisal? The buyer is. So people think it's the buyer's appraisal, but technically, like I said, they're there to protect that lender, okay? So now we're going to talk about your learning objectives for Chapter 17, which is listed there, I told you, on page 388 in your textbook. So when you get done you're going to be able to explain the concepts of value and the different types of value in properties. We have value for many different reasons. This chapter, Real Property Valuation, is dealing with something called market value. But what was a type of value that we learned way back on day one when we were talking about, Karina?
Assessed value?
Assessed value. And that's for what purpose?
Tax purposes.
Tax purposes. So your property has a tax value. This is talking about a market value. And you're going to find out in today's chapter that we have basic economic principles of value that you're going to learn about. We've learned about some of those already as well. Back on day one, when we were talking about basic real estate concepts, we talked about something called highest and best use. Remember that? That's a basic economic principle of value. And we're going to learn about that and more principles of value today. You're also going to be able to describe the different types of appraisal processes used by appraisers. You don't value all properties the same way. How an appraiser comes up with the value for an income-producing commercial property is different than a residential home or a special purpose property like churches and schools and things like that. And you're also going to be able to describe the different types of depreciation. You're going to learn today, guys, that all properties depreciate. Okay, let me back that up. All physical structures depreciate, but land never does. Oh, you want that to start yet, but I'm going to start it anyway now. Let's slide started. This is a little video I found that has a definition of what an appraisal is.
What is an appraisal? Every house is unique. Appraisers are trained and licensed for expertise in putting a value on properties. Appraisers don't work for the buyer or the seller. Their primary mission is actually to protect the lender who's risking money against the home's value. Appraisers have to weigh factors about the property and location, including size, condition, and comparable properties, to appraise its current value. They know how to focus on conditions that affect value. Dishes in the sink don't. Damage and neglect do. Appraisals lower than the proposed purchase price can affect transaction details. The seller might have to lower the price, or the buyer might have to increase down payment or fund additional escrow. Appraisal seems a lot like inspection, but they're not the same. You can think of it this way. Appraisers report on value to the lender, while inspectors report on condition of the house and major components to the buyer. So, expect both appraisal and inspection in your transaction.
Makes it a little more clear about what we are talking about with an appraisal. So, like I said, the appraiser is just trying to find value and give their opinion of it for the lender. So the lender makes sure that they don't have more invested into the property than it's worth. And one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that an appraisal is technically only good for one day. You see it on your slide there? Technically only good for one day. If you look at the definition of appraisal on page 389 in your textbook, it says it's an estimate or opinion of value of a specific property as of a specific date. Well, we know the appraisal doesn't actually get done on the day we go to settlement with our buyers. It gets ordered beforehand. And the appraiser will put into the report, this is my opinion of value, so long as nothing changes. And sometimes an appraiser will say in a report, this is my opinion of value, so long as the following repairs are made. If there is something wrong with the property that the appraiser feels needs to be taken care of to protect the lender, for example, the windows are broken. The appraiser may say, well, this is my opinion of value, but only if these two windows get replaced. So those two things would have to be remedied. Those windows would have to be replaced before the lender would fund the loan, because the appraiser said, hey, it's good, but we got broken windows. You don't see that a lot in conventional appraisals, but because we're in a VA market, we see that here more often than most places, because the VA appraiser will actually say, that window was broken, or it's the seal is broken in this double pane window and it's got moisture between the panes. Appraisers here on our VA loans will call a lot of things that you would never see called on a conventional transaction, because they know that the VA is backing up this loan and they want to make sure that they're able to recoup their money if there is a foreclosure. We talked about some things when we were talking about land use controls and about some disclosure issues when it came to roads. Do you remember? And what did we talk about might cause issues if you were trying to get a loan on a property concerning the roads? Do you remember?
Private or public, who does the maintenance on it?
Lee said whether they're private or public, who's maintaining them? And on a VA appraisal, they're going to say to the lender, these are privately maintained roads. And if that happens, you know what they're going to ask for? A copy of a road maintenance agreement showing who is actually responsible for maintaining the roads. Remember I told you we had some issues with some subdivisions here in our area that the road maintenance was not taken care of, and lenders were like, no thank you, we're not going to loan money in this area until these get rectified. Because if you can't access the property without going through major potholes and things like that, the lender doesn't feel like it's a good investment for the lender to put their money in there. So there's all kinds of things that the appraiser looks at. But it's an estimate or opinion of value of a specific property as of a specific date, technically good for just one day. In your book, it talks about certified general appraisers and certified residential appraisers. One does appraisals for residential properties, and the other one would do appraisals for commercial properties. Okay? We have talked about on multiple occasions already throughout other chapters in the book about what we as agents will be doing that is similar to what an appraiser is doing, which is called a comparative or comparable market analysis when we're performing it for a buyer or seller client, or a BPO, we talked about that, Karina got that one earlier, that we do for a lender, which is a broker price opinion. They consider these an informal analysis. Informal because the lender's not going to rely on your opinion, your information. They will rely on the appraiser's information. They also say don't ever, as an agent, use the term appraisal in your reports. You're not an appraiser. You can't call your market analysis an appraisal. And you are helping them look for a probable selling price, not an opinion of value. And you remember that we have to remove our provisional status if you're going to do a BPO for a lender and get paid for it in North Carolina. You're not allowed to perform a BPO in North Carolina as a provisional broker, correct? Well, you can, for free. You just can't do it and get paid for it. Not too many people want to do that work for free. So now, guys, we're going to go over to page 390. How many of you have been spending a lot of your spare time studying and reading and kind of letting that housework go to the wayside? Becky was nodding and everybody's raising their hand. Well, then you'll be happy to know You may be making your property more valuable. I'm just kidding. But the reason I'm going to tell you that is they tell you that the 4 characteristics of value that are listed on page 390 spell the word dust. Demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. So you probably have more value now that you have all that dust. So let's talk about what these mean. Demand. If no one wants it, I don't care how wonderful it is. If there's no desire for it, no demand for it, it doesn't have value. Utility. Can I put it to a useful purpose? If I bought a piece of land that was zoned residential and I built a donut shop on it, would that be able to be put to a useful purpose legally? No. Why? I would be in violation of the zoning ordinance. That's right. So that would not be able to be put to a useful purpose. So it would have no utility. And on day 1, guys, we learned about scarcity. The more rare something is, the more valuable it is. That's why you pay more for a property on the water than you would for a property not on the water. We only have so much waterfront property available. The more scarce, the more valuable. And guys, transferability. If I can't give you title, are you going to buy this? Whether it's a car or a property, if someone can't give you title, you don't want it. It wouldn't have any value to you. If somebody tried to sell you a car with no title, what would you assume? It was stolen. So if I can't transfer title, and remember we talked about that in the contracts. If a seller cannot give good title, the buyer does not have to buy. The seller would be in breach of contract if they could not give good title. So dust gives you value. Demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. Right? So now we're going to talk about the differences in market value versus market price. Market value is the appraiser's estimate or opinion of value of that specific property as of a specific date, right? And on the top of page 391, it says market price. Guys, what is the market price? That's what the buyer actually pays for the property. Are they often similar?
Yes.
Sure. But they don't have to be. What if Michael's selling me a property and he's my best friend? Might he give me a better deal? Might he offer me a lower price than he would if he was offering it up to everyone else? But I might still get a higher market value. The appraiser comes in and says, based on the analysis of this information, this is what I feel the property's market value is. It's my opinion. And Michael says, that's great, I'm glad it's worth that much, but Brenda's my friend, so I want to sell it to her for a lower price. You're going to learn in this chapter today that that's the reason why when we are looking at comparable properties to do our market analysis, and when an appraiser is looking at comparable properties to do an appraisal on a resale home, they look at recently sold comparable properties and they want to make sure that the transactions are what's called arm's length. If Michael's giving me a great deal because we're friends, that's not an arm's length transaction. We have a connection. We could be family and he charged me more. It still would not be an arm's length transaction. So they look at that. They look at so many different things. The video that showed, they said, look, the appraiser looks at a lot more than just the condition of the property. The home inspector is looking at the condition of the property to tell the buyer if something is wrong, and they might want to consider asking the seller to fix something. Or at least if they're not going to ask the seller to fix it, they're fully aware of what needs to be done. But the appraiser has to look at so many different factors. The neighborhood, traffic. I was an agent for probably 7 years, and I had a friend that wanted to sell her property, so she called me. And her property was so unusual that I picked up the phone and I called one of my friends who was an appraiser, and I said, how in the world do I find comparables for this property? And I started explaining to her about the property. And I said to her, it's on Gum Branch Road, on the corner of Gum Branch Road and Half Moon Church Road. And her response was, then you better find comparables that are also on very high traffic roads, because an appraiser will look at that and it will actually take value away because of the traffic. Remember, we talked about people's preferences, area preference. We talked about that, situs, back on day 1. So that would affect somebody's desirability for a particular property. So that's market value versus market price. Now look at the big one. This was on our quiz when we started. Value versus cost. Every seller in the world would love if every penny they put into their house they would get back in value, but we already said that was a myth. How many of you bought a property and then installed a fence? Did anybody do that? Ah, you did. Do you remember, Maria, what you paid for your fence?
A little over $3,000.
A little over $3,000. Do you have a normal size residential lot in a subdivision, like a half acre or less lot? A little over $3,000. An appraiser will not give anywhere near that much value on an appraisal for that fence. And a seller will go, hey, you do your market analysis, or they find out about the appraisal and they go, why did I only get $1,200 value for the fence? I spent over $3,000 on it. Karina.
Because you get to enjoy the fence while you own the property.
I love you. She said, because you get to, and you got your value out of it, your cost out of it, by enjoying it while it was put up. It contained your children and pets while you lived here. It kept your neighbors from being able to see everything that went on in your backyard. That's where you got your value from it. And the appraiser cannot look at cost, because some people may overpay for something, and some people may have a connection and get a better price. I could have been friends with the fence guy. These are my friends. I bought the materials. We had a barbecue. I fed them, and they came and helped me put my fence up. So if they only looked at what you spent, that person would get no value for their fence. A couple of steaks, a baked potato, and a 6-pack of Bud Light. You know, that's what your fence is worth, because that's what you gave your friend for helping them put up your fence. So see, cost and value do not equate. There's even a story there in your book that says, look, a developer goes out, he buys 2 identical lots. One of them is on a very busy road. One of them is on the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a very desirable subdivision. The lot prices were exactly the same. The one on the bigger road, the busy road, was a bigger lot. It was like 1.5 acres. The one at the end of the cul-de-sac was just a little 1/3 of an acre lot, typical subdivision lot, but it's sitting on the end of a cul-de-sac. He builds 2 identical houses. Same materials, same everything. He spends the exact same amount of money building both of those houses. Which one do you think he could ask a higher price for? The cul-de-sac, because of that desirability. People with children and pets don't want to live on that busy street. They're worried about the safety. Being at the end of the cul-de-sac makes everybody happy, because no one comes down the road unless they live there, so your kids can go out and play and you don't have to worry. So you can see that cost and value are not the same. And we already talked about this on day one. The next thing it talks about in your book is the different forces and factors that affect property value. Do you remember on day one we talked about these things, the forces and factors that influence property value? And the first one that we talked about, guys, was social forces. Trends in marriage and divorce rates, longevity. It's kind of our demographics, right? If you have a town where there is a high divorce rate, where we needed one house for the family, now we need two. So now that everybody needs two houses, that affects the demand. So now that we need two houses, that's going to affect the value because we have a higher demand now. Longevity. People are living longer. Wendy, how old's your grandma again? 96. When we're living to be 96, we need more properties because we still have young people coming out of school, moving out of mom and dad's. That's social forces. The next one says economic forces. How much money do we make around here? Do we have a lot of multi-million-dollar homes around Onslow County?
No.
No. We don't have a lot of multi-million-dollar people around Onslow County. But we have a very high demand for small affordable housing because we have a lot of young people coming here with the military, just starting out. And then we have a lot of people who stay, like Lee. He wasn't born here. He didn't come from here. He came here because the Marine Corps brought him here, and then he stayed. And people who are retired and people who are just starting out kind of want the same thing, small and affordable. When we get older, we don't want to clean anymore, ladies. I know y'all don't want to either, but the kids are gone, so we can downsize. Then they look at the political forces. Zoning, financial policies, all of these things affect people's demand for real estate, so it also affects the value. And then the physical forces. Several years back, guys, somebody went on Good Morning America and said New Bern, North Carolina is one of the best places to retire. And my students who were agents in New Bern were calling me and they said, Brenda, we can't keep anything on the market. We have people calling from up north and saying, I don't care what it is, if it's available, we want it. And they're buying up everything in New Bern. Do you think that affected values? Which way do you think they went? Up, up, up. The demand was immense because people were told on Good Morning America that this was a wonderful place to retire. So people up north were wanting to come here, and one of the major things they said on that show was talking about our physical forces. We have good weather. We have a great location. We make light and call the people who end up here in eastern North Carolina a lot, we call them our halfbacks. And we call them a halfback because they started out in New England, New York, New Jersey, Maine, Connecticut, Massachusetts. And when they retired, they said, we are done with winter, and where did they go all the way down south to?
Florida.
Florida. Because Florida is warm, and it doesn't have all that snow and crazy weather. But then they get to Florida, they go, wow, it's expensive down here. Insurance is very expensive. Homeowners associations are very expensive. Properties were very expensive for years. They're getting a little better. And so they would come halfway back and land right here. We are smack in the middle. I used to pull out of my driveway, go to my mother-in-law's house in West Palm Beach. It took me 14 hours. I would pull out of my driveway, go to my daughter's house in Massachusetts. It took me 14 hours. We're right in the middle. So we have a lot of people coming to this area, so that affects our values. Maria.
Would schools be social forces then?
Maria said, would schools be social forces then? I would say yes. people have a desire to have their children be in the best possible schools. And so they're gonna ask, hey, which school district is this house in? Because they've hopefully already done their research. Be careful not to give your opinion about which school is better, because you might say that because that's where you graduated from, and maybe you're not looking at the statistics. So if someone ever asks, I always say, go do the homework and you determine. I had a buyer once, their children were very much into swimming. And so they researched which school had the best swim team, high school. And so when they came to me, they said, we want to live in this school district. So that was definitely a factor for them.
School ratings is okay to give them,
I'm sorry,
right? School ratings?
School ratings, you're going to say, can you give school ratings? I prefer to have them look them up themselves, just so you don't accidentally give a wrong bit of information. You can help them find that information. I try not to give anything definitive that I might be wrong. I may be looking at an old rating, maybe I have outdated information, so I prefer to help them find the information and let them determine. That way you're not making a definitive statement about something and maybe you're wrong. Okay? So guys, now I told you on the first slide, when we talked about what you were going to learn in this chapter, about the basic economic principles of value. And I have them all listed here. Do y'all remember highest and best use? Highest and best use. Can your highest and best use change? Absolutely. It's got to be something, and it's right up here, if you look right there, legally permissible. What's the next one say? Physically possible. Legally permissible. Physically possible. What's the next one say, Lee, on there? Can you read it?
Lots about that.
Financially feasible. Financially feasible. Maximum value is realized. If all of those things happen, then maximum value is realized. And guys, just because it's the use I would like doesn't mean, remember we talked about in zoning, doesn't mean I'm going to get it. We even talked about applying for a variance. So you go and you say, look, I'm going to have this hardship. It's not going to be feasible for me to do this because of this hardship. Do they have to allow you to have the variance or change your zoning?
No.
They don't. But to have highest and best use, that's what they look at. And there are people, guys, whose job is solely to do highest and best use studies, especially in bigger cities. Because the city wants to know and the county wants to know what's the best way to set things up. The second economic principle that is listed there, and you'll notice I have big arrows pointing to it, and it says substitution. And the reason that I point out substitution to you is they tell you in your book there that this is the cornerstone for what's called the sales comparison approach to valuing property. And the sales comparison approach to value is the same method that we use when we're doing a market analysis. And if you see, it says what this means is that consumers will typically buy what seems to them to be the best bargain. If I said everyone has to have a highlighter to be in this class, and Becky said she would sell you this highlighter for $1 because you didn't have one, but you have to have one to be in this class. And Curtis says, I'll sell you this one for 75 cents. What are you going to go for first? The 75 cents. Because as long as you have a highlighter, you don't care what kind it is, because the rule is you just have to have a highlighter. Now, once his is gone, you might be willing to pay the $1 for Becky's if you still needed one. And that's the way it works. When we are helping people do a market analysis, and when an appraiser is doing an appraisal, they look at substitution. We're going to be doing actual CMAs this afternoon. I'm going to show you the process. We're going to have comparables, and we're going to make adjustments, and you're going to see how that works. But you just have to realize that That's why when we talked about your duties to your seller, that when you're helping a seller come up with a probable selling price, you have to look at their individual needs. If Becky says, I need to make as much money as I possibly can, then when we do that market analysis and we come up with that range, she may want to go on the high end or maybe even go a little above it because she wants to get as much as she can. But if the seller says, I need to sell as soon as possible, then you may say, well, let's see what we're competing with. Let's see what the other properties around here are listed for. And they may want to go in a little under, so theirs will be the best deal. Theirs will be considered the bargain, and they might get an offer first. So that's why we have to listen to our clients and find out what their needs are and help them. So substitution is the cornerstone of the sales comparison approach to value, and it says that the consumer will typically buy what they perceive to be the best bargain. Supply and demand comes next. Did we already talk about supply and demand? Day one. We have a whole lot of houses and nobody wants to buy. What happens to our prices? They go down, drop, drop, drop. But if we have a lot of buyers and no properties or very little properties, the prices of those properties are going to go up because of the supply and demand. And we like to be at the point of equilibrium where we're nice and balanced and things are good. It makes life easier. But appraisers have to look at supply and demand. The next one says conformity. Think of that word, conform. Conformity. This principle states that when you have properties that are similar together, maximum value is typically realized. And for the best way to explain that to you is this is why developers make covenants for their subdivisions. If there were no rules in a subdivision, you can only imagine what it might look like. We talked about that when we talked about land use controls. How you would have a big, beautiful brick two-story, and then if there was no rules, right next to it could be a single-wide mobile home that still has skirting on it. And then next to that might be a three-bedroom brick ranch. And then across the street from that is a double-wide on a permanent foundation. So if we didn't have any covenants or any restrictions in a neighborhood, you would not probably have conformity. And so conformity says if we can just keep things kind of the same, maximum value will be realized. And developers want to keep that in their subdivisions. Even though they're eventually going to be done with that subdivision, they might move on to another one. And if you get a bad name as saying, look, they don't make enough, they let too much hodgepodge in here, it's a mess. I don't want to live in their subdivision because it's a mess. So they don't want to do that. They want to help protect. Remember we said they're changing the term restrictive covenants and calling it protective covenants because they're protecting the future value of your property by keeping that conformity. Because an appraiser is going to look at things around you when they're determining the value of your property. And if everything around you is a mess, it will negatively affect you. The next one, me and Becky and Wendy will understand this one, why I use that graphic for anticipation. Some of you, even younger people, are recognizing it. Glad to know I'm not the only old one. That graphic is a bottle of ketchup, guys, for you youngsters, because there used to be a ketchup commercial that played the song Anticipation, because they said their ketchup was so good because it was so thick and it took so long to get out of the bottle, so you had to wait. But it was worth waiting for. Well, anticipation in real estate can also affect value. Anticipation of future events can make property values go up if it's a positive thing, but it can also make your property values go down if it's a negative thing. When the bypass finally was coming into Jacksonville, property values on the southwest side of town went up. Because prior to the bypass, you didn't want to live in Southwest unless you were stationed at the air station. Because if you were at Camp Lejeune, especially if you were in Courthouse Bay or French Creek, which is further in, if you lived on the Southwest side, it took a long time to get to work. But the bypass cut down the commute time greatly. And now we have the new entrance into Camp Lejeune that just finished up this year. That helped too. So now, some of you made a face, are you not aware? I love that some of you went, right up the road here, Wilson Gate. You can go on to base from the Wilson Gate and go straight to the traffic circle down by the exchange. Karina just got so excited. I'm so glad I shared something with you that made you that happy. I haven't seen you that happy all day.
I thought it only went to the, oh my God, what is it called?
Camp Johnson?
No.
No.
The hospital.
No. Oh my God, they live there, people live there, housing. There you
Oh,
go.
the base housing. Oh, the TT housing.
I thought
No,
that
it goes
was
all the
the
way
other
through
one.
now.
It goes in.
I'm so glad I made you smile like that today.
It's gonna go all the way down to Sneedsbury Road.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's really great. Yeah, look at her now. Now Maria's excited.
It's not quite there yet.
It's not quite there yet, it's coming. But you see, these things affect property values because now people can get to work faster. And it started happening when they knew it was coming in anticipation. But your property value can go down as well in anticipation of future events. They're going to put a waste treatment plant behind your property. A landfill across the road. Even if it hasn't gone in yet, if we know it's coming, your property may go down in anticipation of this happening. So, look, I made her so happy, and then I said the landfill and the waste treatment plant, she frowned. She's like, not so happy anymore now. Thanks a lot. Guys, contribution. Contribution states that the absence of or the presence of an item will either take away from or add to its value. In English, would you pay more money for a car with power windows than you would for a car without power windows? Yes. Do they even make cars now without power windows? Michael said no, but you said yes. Okay, good. I don't know.
Work trucks.
Work trucks, there you go. Maybe that Spark we were talking about earlier. Yeah, with the base model of something. So, and that's what they're stating too. If a property, for example, if I was selling a property and it had a deck, but the property next door that's for sale doesn't have a deck, someone might be willing to pay more for my property because it has a deck than they would for the property that doesn't. And that's what contribution states. The absence of something would take away from its value, and the presence of something may add to its value. And when we do our market analysis later today, and I show you how we make adjustments, that's what's going to help you make it all make sense to you, because it definitely applies to the sales comparison approach to value in property. We have to take into consideration what they have versus what we have. Guys, basically what you do when you're doing a market analysis for your seller is you pretend like you're a contractor, but instead of doing it with tools, you do it with dollars. Here is your seller's house, the subject property. It doesn't have a probable selling price yet because we haven't done a market analysis for them yet. So the dollar sign next to the dollar sign for your seller is a big question mark. Well, then you pull up these recently sold comparable properties in the neighborhood, and you pretend that you're a contractor, except you do it on paper with dollars instead of with tools, and you make all of these comparable properties exactly like your seller's property on paper. So if the comparable has more square footage than your seller's house, you take away some. If it has less square footage, you add some. Because you're trying to make these houses identical to your seller's house. And you start with what they sold for, the price they sold for, and you either take away or you add the value of these things that are different. And then on the bottom you say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, had this house been exactly like yours, instead of selling for this price, it would have sold for this price. Doesn't that sound simple when you think of it that way? And when you do these comparative problems, that's the easy way to keep it straight, is that all we're doing is trying to take these other properties and make them be exactly like our seller's property. And that's what the appraiser does when they do a sales comparison approach to value on a single family home or a piece of vacant land. They look at the other properties that have sold recently that are similar. Okay? Competition. Guys, sometimes competition can attract what we call success can attract what's called ruinous competition. If you don't believe that to be true, think about what happened. Those of you who have been here a long time, I know me and Becky and Wendy have been here, Lee's been here a long time. Of course, you've been here a long time too. All your life. That's a long time. Well, you're not that old, so it's not too long. But before we had Walmart, we had 3 Roses. Do you remember when we had 3 Roses? And 2 Kmarts. And the Roses right here, right by this building that's still there, the only Roses we still have left, was the place to go. I bought all my kids' Christmas there. And then guess what happened? Walmart saw how successful our Kmarts and our 3 Roses were. And they said, we need to come to Onslow County. And when Walmart came in, we're down to 1 Roses. And it's hanging on by a thread. We still have the 2 Kmarts. But have you been to either lately? I had somebody in my weekday class this week said, Brenda, I was so disappointed. I had gone there and I bought a CD and I loved it, and I went back to buy another CD by the same artist. They no longer have an electronics section in the Kmart at Piney Green Road. They've completely taken it out. No CDs, no DVDs, because they're downsizing their store. They just don't have the business. So their success attracted ruinous competition. You can't beat Walmart, Maria says. People are trying, but they're having a hard time. And guys, the last basic economic principle of value that you have there is the word change. Nothing is constant. Everything is subject to change. And appraisers have to study the past so they can better understand the future. We kind of tend to go in cycles. And so the appraiser has to understand, what has gone on in our area so that they can know what's coming in the future. And we are going to take our break. You've had your next 50 minutes of the day covered. So we're going to take our break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the 8 steps in the actual appraisal process. So take a break, meet me back here after.